So anyway, yeah, I travel around doing this and that, whatever anybody's sort of interested in having me do. This is kind of a general fun talk. It's sort of, a little bit light. It's not really directly on point to adventure game creation or interactive storytelling, but people seem to sort of enjoy this. I've gotten my glasses tangled up in my microphone, which is not ideal. Yes, okay. So what I'm going to do is talk about, the future of computer entertainment for quite a while. I sort of keep this lecture updated with latest things, and I'm going to look at 3 different major areas. So technological advancement, kind of demographic and market changes, and aesthetic development of the medium. And I'm going to go from the sort of more concrete and obvious to the increasingly woo-woo, which is kind of a professional term of art. So from the technological advancement, let's start with the kind of state of the art as things are right now. So, if you aspire to doing sort of the best looking video games possible, that's kind of what you're aiming for. And, I'm not just showing Madden out of kind of loyalty to the product. It has to do with the complications of doing this kind of animation and this kind of physics simulation. It's just very hard to get things colliding together and wrapping around each other. These guys are grabbing each other and so on, and compressing appropriately. We can do snooker balls pretty easily, right? That's the physics of doing snooker ball collisions is not very complicated. When you have human beings who are sort of somewhat soft and deformable, and you have to try and mash them together at speed and have them wrap around each other and so on, it just gets a lot more complicated. And in the early versions of Madden, we couldn't do anything even remotely like this. We didn't have the CPU horsepower, but now we're that good. And in fact, I had dinner about a week and a half ago with a guy who worked on one of these games recently, and his job was programming the dreadlock physics. I mean, he just did the dreads, and they're bouncing and they're moving around, and also sometimes these guys, for complicated reasons I won't go into, wear little towels on their butts. So, and the towel has to flap up and down as you run. So, in video games, our graphics look really great until they move, right? We can do photorealism and so on, but when you start getting people moving, in a lot of games, people kind of move like marionettes, and they don't really look quite right. Madden is about the best you will ever see at the moment, at the current state of the art. And that was actual game footage, but to be totally honest, it was carefully selected game footage. It's not going to look like that all the time. In the majority of games, interactions with other people and with the environment are not really properly modeled, and the masses are not properly modeled. So, in fact, things don't really move correctly based on how they, what they weigh. And my walk cycle as a short, fat guy is not going to be the same as, other people's walk cycle and so on. My mass moves differently from more normally proportioned individuals. So we need a variety of new techniques. Inverse kinematics, which produces more realistic interactions with the environment. I'll talk more about that in a minute. Again, I don't know how much you guys know, so I don't want to patronize anybody. This lecture is kind of intended for a general audience. And true locomotion, where we have properly modeling the physical forces. at the moment, normally what we do is we have a walk cycle and we simply move the model through the environment at a rate at which the walk cycle looks approximately correct most of the time. But we don't actually compute the friction between the soles of the feet and the floor that it's under and compute the forces that are necessary to make a person move. And we had a difficulty with earlier versions of Madden Football because we had different run characteristics for each player. Some could run faster than others, but we were using the same run cycle for each one. And so what that would mean is that they would run across the pitch, but the movement of their feet did not really correspond to the speed at which they were moving, so they appeared to be ice skating. And this is just one of these classic things. So, and we need further research on the interactions of non-rigid bodies. And again, snooker balls are one thing, human beings are another thing. Proper transfer of kinetic energy. Cloth is very complicated and very CPU intensive. There's sort of a well-known problem called the armpit problem, which has to do with the fact that when you are simulating cloth, you get these areas where it's folded and crushed, and you can spend enormous amounts of CPU time trying to figure out what it's supposed to do when cloth is being compressed. So inverse kinematics is a technique whereby instead of computing forwards, okay, we have a standardized cycle that we have invented or created in the studio. Instead, you work backwards from where the target is, if it's the ground or if it's something that a person is going to pick up, and you figure out, okay, I need this, this person's arm to reach out and pick up this bottle, and you work backwards on where the bottle is to figure out what each of the joints are supposed to do in the animation. So you're in fact calculating on the fly, and you're doing this in the player's machine. Not in advance in the studio, where the ankle and the knee is supposed to be, based on where what the ground is shaped like. So here's an example. Is it going to run itself? No. Wake up.
The locomotion system developed by Ernest Johansen uses semi-procedural animation to blend and adjust keyframe and motion captured animations at runtime to match any speed, direction, turning angle, and not least, any uneven terrain, including arbitrary steps and slopes.
So these guys' feet always look right. And I'm sure you've all played a lot of games in which, you had a character that walked okay and they looked fine when they were walking, but the minute they started to go up steps, then their feet disappeared into the steps or floated above the steps and so on. And, this is some software that does this correctly, which is really nice. And we need to start doing this in our games. So those are sort of animation challenges that are facing us. Inverse kinematics in order to get these things to look right in relationship to the rest of the environment, and true locomotion so that masses are properly modeled. We also have challenges associated with artificial intelligence, intelligent opponents, which of course is classic. I mean, it goes all the way back to the very first tic-tac-toe games and Arthur Samuel's checkers playing game in 1957. But intelligent teammates, which is actually harder. I'm sure some of you have played escort missions, in which you're given this suicidal idiot that you have to escort someplace, and they're just a huge pain. Voice recognition, so that you can actually talk to your system and have it recognize your commands and so on. And this has to accept all sorts of people without any training. A lot of voice recognition right now requires a degree of training in order to get good, and with video games you can't do that. You expect people to want to pick up the game and play it immediately, and that means they have to understand the English as it is spoken in South London and the English as it is spoken in Jamaica. So, computer-generated speech, something that is actually generated by the system and conveys a personality to the speaker. We can make games that sound like Stephen Hawking, but that's really not good enough. And what I did with Madden NFL is we used recorded audio clips and we cut them up into little bits and we stuck them back together And we needed to be better than the standard sort of British Rail platform announcement, which is, you know, they stick little clips together too, and it's okay. You don't mind that it says, the train now arriving on platform 2 is the 357, you know. We needed it to sound like natural spoken English, and you can do that up to a point when you have a limited domain like American football. But, you know, it will only take you so far. Certainly for adventure games, you're going to need something more sophisticated. So actually computer-generated speech that has a personality for each speaker is a desirable sort of future goal. Natural language comprehension, of course, which is very, very hard, and natural language generation, which is harder still. You know, it's one thing to kind of create sentences out of standardized forms like British Rail platform announcements. It's another thing when you're actually trying to create a completely new sentence that sounds like normal conversation out of nothing at all. So that's way out there in the future. And then, of course, you know, other kinds of AI challenges like pathfinding. Content challenges. Traditional content development costs and time continue to rise. You know, we're making fewer and fewer AAA games every year simply because we can't afford them. So some solutions to this are doing pre-rendered procedural content generation, which lets you do this in the studio, and then it lets artists hand edit the results. You know, you run an algorithm to generate something, and then the artist can go in and tweak it, which is very good for sort of unimportant objects that belong in a pattern like trees. You know, and there's a company called SpeedTree that makes nothing but forest generation algorithms. You just make trees, and they look really good. And then real-time procedural content generation, which again happens not in the studio but in the player's machine. So the trouble with this again is it requires a lot of CPU power, and especially home game consoles are fairly crappy computers. So one of the things you can do about this is use the graphics hardware rather than the CPU. By the way, I have to apologize for these wall of text PowerPoint slides. This is terrible PowerPoint style. But I give this talk in a lot of places where the first language is not English, and it helps if they can read what I'm saying, like the United States. So, that's why I'm patronizing you with these awful slides. Obviously, you have to have heuristics of some kind so that you don't generate nonsense. You don't get trees with the roots on the top and the branches at the bottom. And here's a classic example of procedural content generation. When Spore first came out, they boasted that nothing you would see on the screen would be generated by an artist at all. I don't think that was actually the truth. But it is a really pretty remarkable example of procedural content generation. And, you know, the system has to be able to handle anything that the player creates in the Spore creature creator. And really the only real rule that it had is everything has to have a backbone. Right? So all the Spore creatures have backbones, but that's it. Which is pretty remarkable. So you can't create worms, but you can create almost anything else. So here is, a little Spore creature that I found online. That kind of gives you an idea. Incidentally, if we go to about 4 seconds, you can see a failure of kinematics here because the legs are going under the ground. They weren't doing inverse kinematics. So they've got this procedural content generation system that can make any creature dance, no matter how many legs and arms and heads it's got. And I could go take this creature into the creature creator in Spore and add another few legs and another few arms and so on, and it would still be able to make it dance. Now, it doesn't, it's not Nureyev, but that's pretty cool. That's the kind of thing that we can look forward to continuing to do. So technology changes that we can expect, well, obviously more speed, RAM, and power. That's not a surprise to anybody, which will give us more detail, faster frame rates, and smarter creatures. The effect on game design, which is my primary area of interest, is sort of indirect rather than direct. It's like all this power is great, and it's something we can take advantage of, but it doesn't really change the core function of design, which is to entertain people through play. It simply enables us to do other kinds of things. Broadband and mobile, I'll talk a little bit more about in a minute. I think we can look forward to continued growth of specialized peripherals. You know, the Wii controller really challenged existing paradigms, and the Microsoft Kinect has moved us beyond just a handheld controller. Now there are limitations to the Kinect. There are certain things it's not really very good for, and it has not replaced a handheld controller, and it won't. But nevertheless, this is a whole new thing, and I think we can continue to look forward to other sorts of advances in I/O devices. Most of this kind of fancy stuff will be extra cost items in the fairly near term. It was pretty cool of Microsoft to put the Kinect in with every Xbox. It was not so cool to say it has to be turned on and watching your living room all the time. And looking farther again, real-time ray tracing. So right now, most 3D algorithms paint a scene using what's called the painter's algorithm. They draw objects from the back of the screen to the front towards the virtual camera, so that the objects in front obscure the objects behind. Pretty straightforward the way painters paint things in a scene. However, that does not take into account the location of the light or the behavior of light as it passes through transparent and semi-transparent objects. And in order to do that, you need to do something called ray tracing, where you actually look at every single pixel on the screen and figure out where the ray of light that illuminated that pixel came from. And if it passed through something that tends to bend light, like what we're seeing in this image, glass and liquids and so on, then where did it bend to? You have to have the indices of refraction of all these different things, glass and water and so forth, and work your way back to where it came from in order to figure out what color that pixel should be. Then you do it with the next pixel and the next pixel and so on. So this is a very, very CPU intensive process, and at the moment a scene like this would probably take several minutes on a fairly high-end PC at this point. We would like to be able to do this in real time, 25 or 30 frames a second minimum. And so I think that's something we can look forward to in the farther future. AI hardware, possibly. Neural nets are some kind of massively parallel processors, so we don't have to burden the CPU so much. We've already offloaded the graphics processing from the CPU to specialized graphics processing chips, which is great. But this will enable things like, improved computer vision and so on. Natural language processing chips, maybe, and pathfinding hardware. Pathfinding is one of these things that's very CPU intensive. It's one of the reasons that video games don't have 100,000 person armies. That you seldom see more than a couple of hundred people on the screen at one time. And in fact, a few years ago, you seldom saw more than 15 or 20 people on the screen at one time, just because of the pathfinding workload. So this is a chip that is, this video is actually a little bit old now. Hello, I would like to have a mouse, please. Yes. This is a silent movie. So what you're going to see here is a very, very complicated environment that's changing all the time, with a large number of units that are trying to move through it. And so each one of them has to pathfind its way through not only this changing environment, but also avoiding other units that are possibly moving around and getting in its way. No. So first we create a complicated, messy environment, and then we introduce people into this environment. They all have to try and move around and through it. And what's happening here in this system is that it's actually offloading to a specialized chip the current state of the map, and saying, compute me routes for all all these individual units, and it's going away and doing that, and then it's handing back the results to the CPU again, so that the CPU can then display whatever those particular results were. And it's this back and forth communication between the AI chip and the CPU in order to implement this properly. So as you can see, there's just really large numbers of things doing this. So now there's an interesting question about whether you can get people to pay for an AI chip and how we're actually going to get that out to the consumer. And I don't think people are very likely to buy daughter boards that are specifically devoted to AI. I think probably the place where we're going to put these is on the graphics card chips, that we might be able to persuade ATI and NVIDIA to build these onto their graphics cards so that they can offer this as an additional feature. And and the kinds of people that buy really high-end graphics cards will also appreciate this sort of thing. Virtual reality, of course, is a very great deal of excitement about the Oculus Rift at the moment. We had this once before. Some of you may be old enough to remember the Nintendo Virtual Boy, which sucked. The prices were too high and the quality was too low. It was just really dreadful. And the reality is that stereo vision is not actually needed that badly in that many games. We have obviously 3D space, but do we really need 3D stereo vision? Well, it's sort of nice, but it isn't actually imperative. And there's another issue about virtual reality, which is it's isolating. So, console play is very often a group activity in the home, particularly with younger players. Certainly the right way to play Madden football is with a whole bunch of guys in the same room, and they're all drinking beer and eating crisps and doing the high five and smack talk and all that kind of thing. Or Mario Kart. Mario Kart would be a lot less fun if you couldn't see the other players who were sitting next to you. So, virtual reality is absolutely going to come. It's certainly going to be used in various applications, but it isn't going to totally take over the game industry. I mean, for one thing, enormous numbers of games are played by people sitting on TV, on train platforms and on mobile devices, and you're not really going to want to have your head inside a headset while you're waiting for a train. So, when the quality of the experience is high enough, when the frame rate and the 3D audio is there and so on, and when it no longer makes people upchuck, which is one of our sort of bigger problems. So the equipment has to be cheap and lightweight and durable. I worked on a virtual reality project for the Atlanta Zoo in about 2001, and the head-mount display was $10,000. Now the Oculus Rift has brought that down quite a bit, but the Oculus Rift is still on the order of the price of a console. So it's still a fairly expensive device. Augmented and mixed reality, there's kind of a lot of press about this among the sort of far-out fringe aspects of games. This is the kind of games that you play while moving around through physical space, and you have your mobile device with you, and you look at it, and you look at the world, and so forth. It won't ever be as popular as fully fictitious worlds because, frankly, most people would rather sit on their ass. So, if you sort of compare Call of Duty versus Airsoft or laser tag or something like that, there's a lot more people that play Call of Duty than there are that go out and shoot each other with paintball. Every time a new console comes out, they manage to find some idiot to say that the PC is now dead. I remember this when the PS3 came out. And no more reason for anybody to ever play a PC game again, because now we have the PS3, so PCs are over with. No. The reason has to do with, in part, just simply how you use these devices. The PC is really optimized for a single person who's sitting half a meter away. It's a very intense, personal, direct experience. You are right there with the screen in your face. The console is optimized for several people sitting in a living room, and they're a couple of meters away from it. The PC is an open system which requires no license. So if you want to make anything really edgy, like Super Columbine RPG Massacre, you don't have to, get permission from a publicity-conscious publisher to do it. You can make the most outrageous thing you want to. And the reality is people are always going to own PCs for other things, for doing homework or doing office work or whatever it is. So, of course, there are going to be games on them as well. And finally, the PC technology advancement is continuous. It's not stepwise. It doesn't go in generations. So the latest PC is kind of always ahead of the latest console. This is kind of the growth pattern. So that's sort of the end of the technology section of this. And I want to move on to the demographic and market changes that are having an even larger effect on the game industry at the current moment. Retail sales of video games dropped between 2000 in the United States, but in the U.S., retail sales of video games dropped between 2010 and 2013, 35%. Now that is a really staggering fall off, right? And for only 4 years. And so that means we've got to make it up from other things. And we are making it up with sales on Steam, and we're making it up with mobile content and so on, but we also need to reach out to new markets and new other kinds of players. So one thing that we're looking forward to doing is selling into other cultures. People are going to want their own localized forms of entertainment that are suitable for them. The Indians have Bollywood, the Japanese have manga culture and all that kind of thing. And of course the Japanese have a huge video game culture of their own that has been around for a long time. And I don't think we can just assume that the Islamic world or the rest of Southeast Asia and so on are going to be that interested necessarily in buying Western games. So as we start to reach out to these other people, we're going to have to change what we make and make games that are culturally appropriate for where we're trying to sell. So the West either has to learn to do this or get left behind. If you look at the figures from India, there's 1.2 billion people in India. That is 4 times the size of the United States, right? That is a lot of potential players. They have 57 million PCs. Now the Americans have more PCs than there are people, right? They have something like 301 million PCs, and they have 300 million people. Well, India is way far behind in terms of the number of PCs that are available. They have only 90,000 consoles. And the reason for this is that Indian parents are still pretty conservative. They tend to not want to spend their money on, purely entertainment devices. They want, there's a tremendous amount of emphasis on education and kids doing their homework and so on, and all this sort of pressure. And so they'll buy a PC for the family, but they're much less likely to buy a console. It's too specialized device. But there's 400 million mobile phones in India. That's more than there are Americans on the planet. So, in terms of a potential market, it's pretty gigantic. Now, 90% of them are not gaming enabled. There's still those indestructible Nokia phones from 1999. But that's going to change. And so what we're going to do is we're going to sneak gaming in the back door into India. We're going to sneak it into them on the mobile phones rather than trying to go head in on the PC and the consoles, because probably we're going to start having adults and eventually kids also carrying mobile phones around, and we'll be able to sell them games that way. I think programming outsourcing that has been kind of exciting for a little while is going to slow down. So, there's a certain amount of programming outsourcing that's going to India and to Eastern Europe. But as these countries become richer and their costs of labor go up, then the cost savings will go down. So, and of course, these people are also going to start making games for their home market. So instead of making games for the West, they're going to make games for themselves. The Second World, these demographic terms are kind of old-fashioned now. The Second World was the Warsaw Pact originally. The difficulty with selling into the Second World at the moment is there are too many countries and too little demand, and it's kind of a pain. The Third World, India and China are obviously the ones to watch. They have very large populations, and they have single governments, centralized governments that can implement policies that are friendly to gaming. Working with Bulgaria and Romania and Albania and the Czech Republic and Poland and so on is more of a pain, whereas it's easier to work with one giant country. Bigger populations buy more stuff, that's not a surprise. Those that are farther behind are going to advance faster in percentage terms. So whoever really manages to crack the Indian and the Chinese market is going to make a bloody fortune. Just a staggering amount of money, simply because their growth, our growth rate kind of looks like this, and their growth rate is going to look like this for a while. After those areas, probably the Islamic world, Southeast Asia, and Africa, more or less in that order. It has to do really with the availability of leisure money and leisure time. And the nice thing about the Islamic world in particular is that all the way from Morocco to Iraq, they speak one language. There's a lot of dialects, and they're not that mutually comprehensible. But in the written form, Arabic is Arabic all the way across, and that's very helpful. Probably our biggest problem in reaching out to these other parts of the world is organized piracy. I don't mean the kind of piracy you guys do. I mean, really serious organized piracy. There are people in Taiwan who will kill for a gold master disc, and I mean actually kill. And they can get a hold of a disc, and they can make a counterfeit copy within 24 hours of the original being released, and counterfeit in every respect. The box, the printing, everything that's indistinguishable from the original. So, in order to be able to beat organized piracy, we need, to work with other governments. Governments have to sort of acknowledge and support the idea of intellectual property rights, formalize it in legislation. It's not just enough to pay lip service. You actually have to pass laws, and you actually have to enforce the laws that you pass. And the population actually has to believe that it's better to buy the real thing than it is to buy a counterfeit copy. Digital rights management does not work. It's been tried for a while. It just really pisses people off, and it's a system that is more annoying than it is useful. It often breaks. So another way to approach this is just find new business models in which piracy is not really an issue. So service-based gaming, where instead of selling people an object in a box and saying, okay, this thing is yours, we say, okay, you're going to buy a service, you're going to pay us a little at a time, and then there's nothing really too counterfeit because it requires a network connection. Or, free-to-play gaming, which of course has made a huge difference in the last few years. So when Dungeons & Dragons Online was first brought out, it was a subscription-based model, and you paid monthly to use it. And when they said, no, forget that, you can play for free, they began making 5 times as much money. And they made all the extra money not through paying subscriptions, but through people buying, in-app purchases. So, in fact, you get more money by not charging for your product than you do by charging for your product. By using a different business model where people pay when they sort of want to and are motivated to. Then in Western markets, there are shifting demographics as well, as this picture illustrates. The player base is aging. The average age player is now 31 and rising. And so, that means half of all players are older than 31, which runs very counter to the traditional stereotype about gamers. Older players want different kinds of experiences. I don't have the sort of hand-eye coordination. Well, I never really did, to be honest. But I definitely don't have the kind of hand-eye coordination that I did when I was 17. And, frankly, at my age, I've kind of blown up all the aliens I need to blow up. So, another thing that's going on is that youth markets continue to fracture. It's not just sort of kids and adults anymore. From a media standpoint, there were no such thing as children until the Victorian era. So the Victorians invented children in the sense that they were the first people to create media aimed at children. They wrote the first children's books. And so then we had children and adults, and then the Americans invented teenagers in the 1950s. So then we got another fraction, and we got that. And then we went on and got the tweenies, which are the sort of 10 to 12 year range, who are between children and teenagers, and it continues to fracture and fracture. So each age year has its own interest, and this is especially true for girls. With boys, you can sort of get them blowing up things when they're 10, and they're happy to carry on blowing up things until they're 35. But girls' interests change much more dramatically year on year. And women have arrived as gamers in force. They've always been there, but they were not really kind of properly appreciated. And following the crash of 1983, once Nintendo rescued the game industry and brought out this new console and so on, the nature of the marketing of games changed rather dramatically, so that it was very male-oriented, and we stopped seeing girls as players. If you look at the older Atari console advertisements, you'll very often see, a husband, a wife, a boy, and a girl, and sort of classic, canonical, stereotypical family. But there's a boy and a girl who are both playing with the game. The girls disappeared out of the ads in the 1980s, and so we ended up with this stereotype. But at this point, 42% of the players are female, and in fact, there are now more women playing games than men in the UK, which is fairly boggling. You know, most people just kind of don't realize that. And there are more adult women players than teenage boys. So the traditional stereotype of the teenage boy gamer is gone. It's dead. And in fact, it's been dead for a while. You know, it's pretty simple demographics, really. When you think about it, no, you're a teenage boy from the age of 13 to the age of 18. But you're an adult woman from the age of 18 to the rest of your life. So there's simply more of them to play games than they are doing it. But women are interested in somewhat different kinds of challenges. I'm not saying that, you know, it's a total division. There's definitely some overlap. But the nature of women's expectations about play are somewhat different. They don't like being thrown in at the deep end to sink or swim nearly as much. They prefer to have tutorials that explain what's expected of them, and so on. Now, again, I want to emphasize, you know, this is not a hard, fast pink and blue thing. The toy companies have a vice president of boys and a vice president of girls, and they never talk to each other, which I think is truly odious, but that's the way they work. You know, adult gamers, there's much more overlap. But if you do want to appeal to a larger demographic, you know, if you want to appeal to female players, you have to be aware of the sorts of things that turn them off. So, other things that we can look forward to that are going to affect the way we distribute games: real broadband, electronic software distribution enables richer versions of existing online games. And by real broadband, I mean truly fast. You know, 3D positional speech, new kinds of games that are not possible before. Mobile entertainment, there's an interesting thing going on because right at the moment there's a big tug of war between formats. So I'm looking at growth, but not totally explosive growth. It's rapid, but it's not gigantic. Electronic software distribution will be the saving of us all, probably. Right now, it's incredibly stupid to transmit digital bits around in a lorry. So it's slow, it pollutes, it's wasteful of natural resources. You know, you keep your bits warm and guarded by security guards and lighted in a shop. You know, and what is the point of keeping bits warm? So, you know, electronic software distribution is absolutely the way of the future, but we have to solve a couple of problems. First, it's got to be faster to download a game than it is to drive to the shop and buy it. And so, you know, you really need to be able to download several gigabytes in 30 minutes. And again, we've got to solve the piracy problem. So, you know, and we will solve this with encryption system and distribute on demand methods and so on. And the nice thing about digital distribution is that it will enable us to serve niche markets. So the video game industry today, well, at least the traditional one, the bandwidth available is limited to the shop shelves. You know, it's like the terrestrial broadcast spectrum. When in Britain you had 3 channels. You know, in the old days, BBC One, BBC Two, and ITV, and that was it, because that was all the terrestrial broadcast spectrum that you had available. And so the shelves were dominated by a few big publishers, just as the airwaves were dominated by a few big broadcasters. And so naturally, everything was kind of equally stupid. You know, it was aimed at the least common denominator. That was certainly true of American television when I was a child. You know, it was all aimed at kind of the lowest level. So if you want to have a game that's about the Civil War, the English Civil War or the American Civil War, take your pick, you know, that's a pretty specialized niche market, and you're not really going to get yourself on the shop shelves that easily, because the shop isn't going to want to buy it because, you know, they just don't expect that many people to pay for it. But if you deliver via the internet, the shelf space is infinite. Anybody can set up a website and sell a game. You don't have to guess how many copies to manufacture, which is really huge. Any of you read about the recent archaeological excavation in Alamogordo, New Mexico to find the Atari cartridges? Right. So they manufactured way more ET cartridges than they could sell. And in order to take a tax write-off of them, they had to physically destroy them. Otherwise, they would sit around on the books as an asset, even though they were worthless. And so they had to take them to the town where the first A-bomb was set up and dig a big hole in the ground and bury them and cover them with concrete. So, and you know, the nice thing about this is that small developers can serve small markets, which is great. Some unanswered questions about electronic distribution. Is the retail shopping experience important? You know, are there people that actually like buying games in a shop? Do retailers add value? You know, can you ask questions of the person behind the counter and so on? And another phenomenon is that some game sales are impulse purchases. So there's a particular thing that happens in the United States, which is that children whine in Walmart. and the parent says, if you shut up, I will buy you a video game. And it's, yes, score for us. You know, this is how we get money in our wallets, children whining at Walmart. So that kind of impulse purchase in a shop. Now, Walmart is a department store. It's not a game shop. So, you know, I think sales will continue in department stores after the game shops have all shut up and died. Another unanswered question is whether it's important to get a box at Christmas. You know, I mean, how many people feel really excited, a little envelope that says, here is the URL of your present? So, you know, it's sort of, and we need Christmas. I mean, it used to be that we made 50% of all the money that we made in a year was made in the 3 months before Christmas. So if it didn't exist, we would have to invent it. So, you know, how is Christmas going to fit in to the electronic distribution issue? Mobile entertainment, well, there's just too damn many devices. You know, mobile phones, you know, lots of different ones, tablet PCs, and iPad, and phablets, and netbooks, and on and on and on and on and on. And they all have different screen sizes, you know, different resolutions, different amounts of RAM, different CPU. It's like the PC in the old days, right? So no one device really has the features needed to do everything, and we have not yet seen a convergence or a coalescence around a particular approach to things. You know, we're still getting handheld devices like the Nintendo DS that have a stylus and things that have a D-pad and so forth. I think in the end, actually, what's going to happen is that mobile telephones as telephones are going to go away, and that mobile telephony is going to find its way into everything else. So right now, every object that you buy has a digital clock in it. And, you know, it's just a sort of a natural thing. Your microwave has a digital clock. You know, everything has a digital clock. And that's because digital electronics can just, you know, clock electronics can easily go into anything. I think before very long what's going to happen is that we're going to start putting mobile telephony into everything else. So that's kind of my look at the future of the demographic growth. There's a sort of a thing going on right now that some of you are probably aware of called Gamergate. It is a reactionary backlash against these changes. It's you know, there's a lot of upset about what are called social justice warriors, destroying and ruining the game industry for all time by making games that women might want to play, and so on. You know, and including blacks in games, which we pretty much don't do. But we're thinking about maybe it might be a nice thing to do, because if you want to sell a game into another culture, you really kind of want to have heroes that reflect the culture you're trying to sell to, and so on. Now, these things are totally inevitable. Unfortunately, there's kind of this hard coterie of people on Twitter who are very upset about this and fighting about it. However, there's about less than 10,000 of them, and worldwide there are hundreds of millions of gamers. So, you know, although there's been a lot of press about this recently, in fact, this reactionary backlash is doomed. It, you know, cannot possibly succeed, simply because the game industry will follow the money. And if you've got cash, we will make games to sell to you. Looking farther on, I want to just, you know, go again farther out into the blue sky and look at the aesthetic development of the medium. Graphical realism alone is no longer enough. Obviously, I said we still have work to do on animation, but, you know, we can do photorealism very well. But it used to be that we could take the same game and improve the graphics and say, look, new graphics, and sell it again. We can't do that anymore, right? People will no longer be suckered by that. So we need new ways of attracting the customer than just this game looks better. So we need visual design innovations, non-photorealism, new art styles, other kinds of things like Monument Valley that have a very visually distinctive art style. And I think this is in particular where adventure games come in, because they're a bit slower. You don't have to, and people don't expect you to create photorealistic environments. You know, you are creating an environment in which you are devising an aesthetic that people are going to appreciate by looking at it. Whereas if I'm running around like a crazy man with an AK-47, you know, in a shooter game, I don't really have time to admire the environment. In fact, the environment is very likely to be a distraction to me. So visual design innovations and game design innovations too. You know, just new kinds of games, new ways to play that move beyond our sort of traditional mechanisms. So, you know, the analogy that I like to use is what happened with Impressionism. The first Impressionist painters were so shocking that the French Academy refused to exhibit their paintings in their shows. They said, this is not what painting is for. It's completely outrageous. You know, I can't see things clearly. It's all fuzzy. Get out of here. You are not real painters. And so they held their shows in a private home, and, you know, and they changed the world. So who's our impressionists? You know, who is changing gaming so dramatically that the gaming powers that be are completely shocked and don't want to touch it? Right? Who out there is making a game that EA would never sell? You're our impressionists. You know, you're the guys who are going to change what gaming is about in the same way that Impressionism provided a new way of seeing. And then the story that, of course, is chiefly of interest to you is integrating interactivity and narrative. We are very good about this in one domain. We can make Schwarzenegger movies. Right. So, you know, Gordon Freeman is our Arnie. We're very good at, you know, action adventures and Half-Life and things like that, where there's all action, there's no character, there's no emotion. You know, Gordon Freeman is intentionally opaque, or not opaque. He's transparent. He's totally transparent. He doesn't look like anything. There's a picture of him on the box, but that was invented by the marketing department. There's no mirrors in the Half-Life game world. So you can't actually go and see what you look like, and that's intentional. They wanted everybody to feel like they're Gordon Freeman. So you have this completely transparent character, and to further emphasize that, he doesn't speak either. So he has no voice. Other people talk to him, but he doesn't talk. So the question is, okay, and that's fine for a shooter. You know, there's no problem there because the domain of activity is really limited. But the question is, can we do this in other contexts? You know, can we make interactive romantic comedies or soap operas or political thrillers? The computer was designed initially in order to compute ballistics tables for artillery shells. And that's really what it still does, effectively. It's good at crunching numbers. And so essentially most of what we do that we do well is physics and economics, right? And the majority of games out there are based on either physics or economics. The question is, can we do this other stuff that is actually a great deal more sophisticated? You know, the nature of human relationships and so on. And it requires devising mathematical models to represent these kinds of things, and that's not easy. Also, I feel like to continue to expand the medium, we need to get rid of some old tired conventions that we've used for a long time. Some of them are sort of a turn-off to new gamers. So logic and common sense are not important. I'm going to take a second and rant about something called the Conceptual NonSequitur. Is anybody here old enough to have played James Bond Tomorrow Never Dies? No. Yes, one person. Right, you poor bastard. Okay.
Don't ask me anything about it. It's been so many years. I just know I've played it.
Right. Well, James Bond Tomorrow Never Dies was for the PlayStation 1, right?
Oh God, yeah.
Yeah. It was a third-person shooter. You were James Bond. You were armed only with a pistol in the very first level. You're trying to sneak into an enemy airbase, a Soviet airbase, with just your pistol, right? And right outside the airbase, there was an oil tank. And if you stood back and you shot the oil tank with your pistol, you could blow it up. The Mythbusters have proven you can't really do that, but, you know, leaving that to one side. So you could blow up the oil tank, and if you did that, you found a medical kit inside. Yeah, right. Now let's think about this. Now the thing is, a normal human being that is not a gamer, right, they might use their brain. They might think, maybe it's not a good idea to create a really big explosion right where I am. You know, when I'm trying to sneak into an enemy airbase armed only with a pistol. Of course, gamers know that there's a convention that anything you can blow up, you should blow up, because there might be a medical kit inside. But a normal person wouldn't think of that, because that would be stupid. They also, think, here's an airbase that's got 5,000 Soviet soldiers. They've got nothing to do. Making a really big explosion right here isn't such a good idea. Of course, we also know there's another convention that no matter how big an explosion you make, no more than 3 or 4 people will ever come to investigate. So a normal person doesn't blow up the oil tank because that would be stupid, so they don't get the medical kit, so they're at a disadvantage. We've just punished them for using their brain. And, that's a conceptual non sequitur, and I think we should avoid it in games that try to be somewhat representational of the real world. Pac-Man, totally abstract, arbitrary world, arbitrary rules. Bananas are worth 500 points. Okay, fine. If you can blow it up, you should blow it up. Levels always end with a boss. Soldiers are expendable cannon fodder. Players prefer destroying to building. This has been profoundly disproven, thank goodness, by Minecraft. And Minecraft is the most awesome construction game, in a long, long time. Women should always have huge breasts and few clothes. This puts women off of buying games. It's also certainly not going to work in the more socially conservative parts of the world. The reality is that if you want to appeal to a female market, you don't have to make pink games. You don't have to make games that say, for women across the box in big letters, because that's not going to help you either. What you need to do is just avoid pissing them off unnecessarily. Right? Because, women want to play shooters too, but they don't want to be pissed off unnecessarily. So you just leave out the stuff that you know is going to annoy them, and suddenly you will have this enormous market that you had hitherto been ignoring. So we've got to replace some of these tired old conventions in order to reach these new markets. And I think it's important for us to gain the cultural status of an art form, because that discourages people from trying to censor us. I founded the International Game Developers Association just 20 years ago today in order to fight the censorship fight in the United States. Because what had happened was Mortal Kombat came out, and the United States Congress completely lost its collective shit. Right? And they dragged the game industry in front of them and had these hearings, and Nintendo said, oh, we're child-friendly, no blood, we're child-friendly, we're not about all that nasty violence. And then Sega got up to do their testimony, and they held up an enormous blue gun called the Nintendo Eliminator. And they said, oh yeah, no violence, right, Nintendo. So what happened was the industry pointed fingers at one another instead of saying to Congress, screw you, First Amendment. We didn't have First Amendment protection at that time. We finally got it in 2011. But people are less likely to try and censor you if they consider you to be an art form rather than a toy for children. So we really need an aesthetic for judging and a vocabulary for discussing interactive artworks rather than just kind of game reviews. We need really, truly serious criticism by well-educated people. Game reviews pretty much come down to, it sucks! Or it rocks. And real criticism is more sophisticated, and it requires an understanding of culture and other art and the human condition and all these other sorts of issues. That is what art critics do, and the more of that, the better, as far as I'm concerned. Academic study of the medium, this is now starting to happen in a serious way, thank goodness. Again, the more the better. Highly publicized and well-respected awards. We don't have any Oscars. We have the BAFTAs here, we have various awards in the United States, but we don't have one single worldwide standard that everybody agrees on. And it really helps to be able to hold up the very best of what you have to the public and say, behold, here is, the finest works from the best among us. Now, the Oscars are corrupt, and there's all sorts of other problems associated with awards, which I recognize, but nevertheless, until you have some kind of a way of recognizing people, you're still going to be down there. There's not that many toy awards. People don't pay that much attention to toys. And speaking as a game designer, of course, I would like there to be a cult of personality, just like there is around film directors. There are disadvantages to this, obviously, but art requires an artist. It requires somebody that people can admire. It really is helpful when you can look at a work and say, yes, I can tell that's a Sid Meier game, or a Will Wright game, or a Peter Molyneux game, So, academic research, the industry doesn't do it. We just don't do basic research very much. Electronic Arts hired an AI guy once in order to be able to do the open field running of a whole bunch of people trying to tackle one guy who's dodging and weaving among them. But we don't do it all that often. So there's a lot of opportunities that academic research can provide to the industry. Technical work, computer-human interaction work, which again is something the industry does not do nearly enough on. We create our user interfaces by guess and by God, and we play test them a little and we say, okay, that's good enough. But we don't really apply formal methods very often. Aesthetic and ludic research on the nature of narrative and art and so forth. So, and above all, academic research does not have to produce commercial products, which is one of the reasons that it's so awesome for us as in the industry is that we can go to these people and say, we would like to see what you're doing, we'd like to have work on this sort of thing, and it doesn't have to be saleable. So looking forward to the farther future then, 2050, we're looking at sort of 35 years out. Well, if you look back, because it's been about 30 years or so, we're looking forward about 30 years or so, how we actually play is really defined primarily by the physical shape of the device. I mean, I know that seems a little counterintuitive, but the reality is you've got a handheld or a mobile, which is you use on the bus or on the train, or when you have a little spare time. You have the console, which is set up in the living room. You have the PC in the home office or the bedroom, the kid's bedroom, whatever. And the physical location of these devices and their size and the position where you sit when you use them is really distinct for each category, right? So the convergence between these will be partial, not total. The PC will never completely go away. The console will never completely go away, and the handheld will never completely go away for this reason. A computer monitor is simply better than a television. It's a more expensive device, it's higher resolution, people will pay more for it, and you sit very close to it. Handhelds will never, ever, ever contain the best hardware. They can't. They don't have room for a fan. The best hardware creates heat, it uses a lot of power. Handhelds need to be low power, and so on. So, and a PC is just a poor machine for group local play. Obviously, group network play is another story. But group local play, the PC is absolutely optimized for one person. So, in online distribution, you had a whole lot of different people with their hands out between you, the developer, and the consumer. And with online distribution, the new value chain is a great deal shorter. You have a developer and a provider and a consumer. So it's you and Steam and your purchasers, which is really nice because you're getting a much bigger chunk. Only publishers with development capability will survive. Otherwise, there's no real need for them to exist. Probably the telecoms will start becoming key providers. You're already seeing Sky and Virgin offering games online via their cable boxes. I think the retailers will go away. The Christmas question remains unanswered, but frankly, the cost issues, particularly out as far as 2050, are sort of unanswerable. Why manufacture this physical object if you don't have to? And I think in the long term, there's actually not going to be any storage medium in the consoles at all. There's not going to be a CD drive or DVD drive or a hard drive or anything, and it's all going to be downloaded instantaneously. Blink, you fire it up, you say, I want to play this game, and it comes down like that from the server, and you can play it, and it gets stored again on the server. This isn't my slide, I ripped it off. This is the guy I ripped it off from. So the CPU, probably numerous specialized processors, or some kind of easily reconfigurable massive parallelism for AI. Inputs, multiple intelligent cameras watching the players. We're already seeing the beginning of that with the Kinect. Cameras tracking eye movement. That's a really big thing. Being able to know where the player is watching is very useful. Multiple microphones, so you can tell exactly who's saying what. We will still have hand controllers, and they will be largely similar. They may have additional features of some kind, but basically the shape of the human hand is not going to change dramatically. It's going to be pretty much this big and have this many fingers, in 2050. And players still need physical feedback. The problem with playing a shooter game on the Kinect is that holding up your finger like a gun and going choo just doesn't feel the same as pressing a button that represents a trigger. We're going to have extremely high resolution and microscopic pixels. Tens of thousands of frames per second. A single screen that supports multiple viewers. So it's going to actually redraw the screen for each person who is watching, and it's going to figure out what to draw for each person's viewpoint based on their eye position. So that each viewer will see a personalized image. Stereo vision without glasses. This has already been tried for the Nintendo 3DS, but it's not very good for children. So we need to improve that so that we don't have a health warning label on the devices. Again, eye tracking will solve this. Audio, it would be nice to have truly fully 3D audio with thousands of channels. Right now, the complexity of our audio environments is limited by the number of channels we can add together at one time. And, and there's only so many. Exabps broadband. truly seriously large amounts. In the UK, we're sort of currently at about 20 megabits per second, and it would be nice to improve that in the next 35 years. Instantaneous upload, download, and save. Cameras are uploading images. You can show yourself while hiding your living room, so as to preserve a degree of privacy. As I said, no local storage. It will still exist on PCs, but it won't necessarily exist on consoles. I want to talk about a few popular fantasies. For those of you who are starting to get bored, we're nearing the end, that are sort of popular among people who fantasize about the future. One of them is the all-over virtual reality bodysuit. These might someday get made as a very high-end option for fanatics, but what we really like about video games is pick up and play. And if you have to take off all your clothes and put on the equivalent of a wetsuit every time you want to play a video game, it's going to be kind of a distraction. You can't just pick it up and play it. And the other big problem is that you have to have it cleaned all the time. And since the number one thing that the all-over virtual reality bodysuit is going to be used for is porn, the cleaning issue is going to be big. Jacks into your brain, like the Matrix. Only nerds think this is a good idea. If you go out on the streets of London with a clipboard and a microphone and walk up to people and say, excuse me, ma'am, but how would you like to have a jack in your brain? The video games will be totally awesome. Wouldn't you like that? They will call the police. So, this is not going to happen in the next 50 years. Biology is way harder than electronics. Artificial people. Yes. We are going to have artificial people in the games that will be good enough for the game. The thing is that when a novelist writes a novel, they don't use their whole novelistic character creation ability for every single character in it. There's a lot of people where the detective walks into the bar and says, "Give me a shot, Joe." And Joe, the bartender, gives him a shot, and that's kind of all the interaction the detective has with Joe. The bartender is not a terribly sophisticated individual. And so we can certainly create artificial people at that level. You don't expect to be able to discuss Wittgenstein with the bartender. So I think we can do this to a degree that is satisfactory for gameplay, and for things like adventure games with interactive storytelling. A lot of real people aren't that bright anyway, so you don't actually need to have tremendously sophisticated AI for these simpler forms of interaction. So the games, well, we're still going to have driving, shooting, war, and puzzles. That's not going to go away in the next 35 years. Those are just basic kinds of things that people like to do, and that, are enjoyable, and they provide different sorts of entertainment. The puzzles for the mental exercise, the driving and the shooting for the kind of physical and high-speed reactions and so on. What we will add is more sophisticated human interactions. So, romance, politics, and things like that at the moment we're really not very good at. Automatic difficulty adjustment and handicapping. Right now, dynamic difficulty adjustment is a field that's still sort of being investigated, and we're doing it in fairly clumsy ways. I don't know how many of you have played God of War, but in God of War, at a certain point, you can get to a point where suddenly up pops a little text box that says, and I paraphrase, "Looks like you suck. Wouldn't you rather play this on easy mode?" Which really pisses off the hardcore gamers. Right? So, but Half-Life does something rather clever. When you smash open a crate, the very first thing it does is it goes and looks to see what your health state is and your ammo state. And it looks like if you're pretty beat up and your ammo's low, it puts more stuff in the crate. And if you're all, full up on everything, it puts very little stuff in the crate or nothing at all. So that's kind of a nice little way of helping the people who are farther behind to get farther ahead. And I think we're going to look forward to seeing new kinds of non-challenge based entertainment that's not necessarily about achieving things or what I like to call earning the right to play. So, most games that are sort of level-based today, you simply cannot proceed until you earn the right to play farther by achieving certain kinds of things. I think we can look forward to more sorts of entertainment that aren't really technically games at all. They're kind of like Club Med. You know, where there's all kinds of things you can do. You can jet ski, you can parasail, you can go swimming, you can go diving, and so on. But you don't have to earn the right to do any of them. You know, you simply are given the opportunity to enjoy yourself in these ways. Virtual tourism. Second Life kind of offers this right now. Games will be a normal part of all education. The debate about that will be over. We will be using games for everything in 2050. And all the world and all ages will play, and the moral panic about games will be over. You know, are games causing violence? No, they're not. You know, the preponderance of the evidence is building up. And the freak out about that, you know, which began really as far back as the 1970s and has sort of come up again periodically. But we've now raised a generation of children who miraculously did not all turn into serial killers. And so, you know, they're not going to be questioning this. So, really, you know, what all this has come down to is it's actually not about the technology. The technology is awesome and it's going to enable us to do all kinds of exciting things. But from the standpoint of what we will be building in the future, what really matters is the people and what it is that they want and what we want to make for them. So don't sort of think in terms of what can you build, because reality is you can build almost anything. What really matters is what do you want to build and who do you want to build it for? That's it. Thank you very much. I know I'm well over my time.
No,
One final crass commercial announcement.
Take some questions, Ernest.
Can I?
Yeah.
Okay, right. Crass commercial announcement. I wrote some books. I brought some for sale. So this is called Fundamentals of Game Design, 3rd edition, which is a 650-page book about game design, sort of from the ground up. Anyway, questions? Yes, sir.
Can you actually watch a football game now?
In what
Are you
sense?
able to watch a football game after making a football match?
Oh, me personally?
Yes.
Oh, absolutely.
Making them for so long.
Yeah. No. One of the things that happened is that I got into that. They said you're gonna be the lead designer on a football game, and I actually didn't know very much about football. And so I learned to appreciate it. So when I got into it, it actually looked like a bunch of big, heavy guys smashing into each other and falling down, which is probably what it looks like to you. And now I know what they're doing and why. So, yes, I can see, okay, these guys are trying to trick that guy into thinking that he was going there, but in fact he really went over here, and it's all a big chess game. Because you have these 11 guys who are trying to fake out these 11 guys. And it's much less random than soccer, where people often just sort of seem to kick the ball down the field and hope somebody gets it. You know? And American football, possession and control of the ball is really critical. So there's a great deal of, you know, very precision activity, even though it looks like a bunch of big fat guys smashing each other. Anybody else? Yes?
Do you think there's any other fields that make good parallels in terms of development? For example, do you think the development of cinema kind of parallels how we'll see computer games and entertainment?
Well, of course, cinema has been around for close to 100 years now. I don't know if you're talking about the past or the future.
Well, the past. Do you think it's sort of... Was there the same kind of moral panic dilemma when
they did
moving pictures came out?
Right. Yes. And you know, our moral panic is compounded by the fact that the player is personally involved and is being asked to cut the heads off people with a chainsaw, which, you know, in the past, in movies, you can only watch people having their heads cut off with a chainsaw. So, you know, technically, we have a whole other set of issues that I don't even have time to discuss. But socially, I think that you know, it's going to be largely the same. You know, that there will be little spikes of freak out from time to time, just like there were with video nasties in the 80s. You know, where everybody sort of panicked about video nasties, and now you never hear about them again, which came along with the arrival of the VHS player, right? And so, you know, we will continue to get occasional freakouts when the sort of right wing and conservative press, you know, says, "Ooh, look at this! Isn't this awful?" But then it will go away again. So, yes.
How do you think games will be financed in 2050?
I think largely the way they are now. That is to say that there will continue to be and be an ever-growing indie movement. And the thing that makes that possible is the development of middleware, because indie game development was just really hard back when you had to write your own drivers for every different VGA card, right? And you needed large companies that had the sort of resources that could put behind all that sort of thing. Fortunately, middleware has just made it so much easier to make a game that, in fact, you need a lot less money to do it. But I'm convinced that in 2050 there will still absolutely be AAA games because people will want to buy them. And that's going to require, large amounts of cash. So I think it will look like it does today, except that there will be even more indies than there are now. And the middleware will continue to be, to get better and better and better. I mean, Unity is pretty awesome now. When do you see it in 2050? Yes. I'll get back to you.
Okay. Are games changing us as individuals or society?
Yes, I think they are. I think one of the things that particularly young people who've grown up with him are expecting is more of a degree of agency over things in their lives. They're expecting interactivity out of stuff. They're expecting to be able to do things that change things. We're less willing to tolerate being told this is how it is, and more of a tendency to say, I want to change this. I mean, you put a little kid in front of a video, and if they haven't yet learned that you can't change it, they're going to try to change it. They're going to say, where are the buttons? I'm touching the TV screen. Nothing's happening. What's wrong? And we're raising a generation of people that are used to interacting with what's going on. So yes, and also, we are teaching people to expect instant response to things when in fact, in the real world, things happen slowly and unreliably. And so, we may be creating a generation of people who are rather impatient, and who expect things to be kind of predictable. And how that's going to shake out in the farther future, I don't know. It certainly is bad for politics. Things are, politics requires compromise, and games don't. In games, the object is to kill somebody's ass, and you repeatedly try until their ass is dead. You can't do that in politics. So, yes, there's a question over here.
Yeah, with more and more indies and games becoming easier to make than ever, what would you say would be the solution to an increasingly flooded market?
There isn't a solution. There's really nothing you can do about that. I mean, the fact is, the App Store is full of gigantic quantities of games that simply don't, that people don't make any money off of. And it's very hard to get noticed. And the one big advantage that the publishers continue to have over the indies is that they have money for marketing. Whereas most indies set aside all their money for development, and they don't set aside any money for marketing. They don't even think about it. So it's inevitable, and there isn't any solution, frankly. I mean, you can hope to get a good position on Steam or on the App Store and so on. There's going to be a shakeout. There's enormous numbers of indies that make a game and then sort of disappear like spring wildflowers. They've done their thing and now they're gone because it didn't sell and they don't have any more money to make another one. Those are the breaks. Yes, behind you with the beard.
On a similar kind of vein, you mentioned about the value chain that's changed kind of dramatically now that you've got digital distribution and things. Just in a similar kind of vein, what do you think that there might be a lot more restrictions placed because it's very free at the moment? You think in the future it might be a bit more, specific? Or you need to be. You mentioned you have this kind of. It would be good to have the staple of a game, developer or a publisher. Do you think there'll be some? You need to be this branding to sell this game here, or?
Well, it helps. It certainly helps if there's some kind of branding that people identify and say, yes, I want to buy this person's games. And that, of course, was the big innovation that Nintendo used to save the game industry in 1983. They said, we promise that the games will not crash. We promise that they will meet certain quality standards and that they will not be buggy and so forth. Which before that, anybody could make an Atari cartridge, and as a result, an enormous number of really crappy cartridges got made, which was partially responsible for the death of the industry at that point. And then Nintendo came along and said, we're going to guarantee the quality, and that was very helpful. We might see that for electronic distribution in the future. Yes, I don't know really, because I've never released a game on Steam, I don't know what you have to prove to Valve to make sure that your game is good enough to get on Steam, but I think, there's probably some limit. So, yes, I think that will help, but it's going to be a restriction that's based on quality, rather than just an artificial restriction like the size of the shop shelf. In front of you, there was a gentleman here. Yeah.
You mentioned one of the things you felt was going to happen in 2050 was that physical media was going to be obsolete, and I think you mentioned that streaming was a possibility.
Yeah.
So you think a service like OnLive will make a comeback, or do you think it'll be more towards digital download sort of thing?
I think OnLive certainly can, or something like it. I mean, one thing I'm pretty confident of is that none of the major players today are necessarily going to be major players then. If you look at who were the major players 35 years ago, and you look at who they are now, it's dramatically different. So precisely who it is, I don't know. But I think when we get, really, really, really fast broadband, you're not actually going to know the difference. You're going to start with the machine, you're going to say, I want to play this game. And whether it is streamed or whether it is a digital download, you won't be able to tell, frankly, because it's just, going to come down like that. Yes?
Yeah, I noticed you had a slide from facade in,
yes.
in that. Interactive narrative and human believable characters is a very hard problem.
That's what my PhD is about.
Which is why I'm asking this question.
Yeah.
It's like if you look at Tailspin, which was 1976 big, and then
Yeah.
Versu, which is probably the state of the art to be on today, which is 2014, and
right.
We've moved very far. So where do you think we'll be in 2050?
I think in 2050 we will have learned enough about creating credible and coherent automatedly generated stories that they will be good enough that people will sort of routinely accept them, and that they won't feel like these sort of slightly artificial, clunky things that we have today. One of the things that we've got to do is enormous amounts of work on creating the mathematical models that generate psychologically realistic people, right?
So a lot of, computers, as you alluded to, are very, very good at mathematical equations. But they're very good at expressing things like love and
right, right. And we've got to learn how to fake that.
Well, we as human beings don't really understand it.
No, right. Well, but, you turn on the BBC now, now we're in England and not America, so the quality is way higher. But, there's a lot of dramas on TV that you see that have been handcrafted by professionals, where you still say, I don't think that guy would do that. That doesn't really work for me. I think the characterization here is weak, or that character is really two-dimensional, and so we pass a lot of these, judgments on things. And yeah, it's not easy. And with books, but the thing is, you can still sell books with crappy characterization and crappy storytelling to particular audiences. So, classic example is Tom Clancy. So you sell these cruddy airport thrillers, or you sell, Mills and Boon romances.
So 2050, we can aim for Tom Clancy and Mills and Boon.
Well, we've got Tom Clancy. We've got Arnie movies. We've got Schwarzenegger movies now, and I think we can pretty much do Tom Clancy movies okay now, because the audience for those kinds of storytelling is not very demanding. By 2050, we will be getting more sophisticated about other things like love and politics, which require much more fine-tuned interactions among people that that generate interesting and surprising responses You know, in an Arnie movie, what happens is that somebody shoots Arnie in the shoulder, and he goes, ow, and then he goes on. And that's, you know, that's really kind of the only change in his response. But, you know, with a love story, you need a much more sophisticated sort of interaction. So, you know, most game AI is fake, right? It's smoke and mirrors. It's just good enough to give people an enjoyable time. And of course, you know, it's not supposed to clobber them either. I mean, we can make games whose AI is so good people can't win, but that's not acceptable either. So we need to create games good enough to fool people into thinking that something real is happening. And it is going to require, you know, mathematics. That's what's driving it. I mean, of course, we can still tell games that we do today with branching storylines and, you know, being able to make decisions at certain points where the outcome is really very predictable. And I don't think there's anything wrong with the classic branching storyline approach, and we will continue to do that. But we will also, over the next 35 years, get a lot better at emergent storytelling and computer-generated plots. I'm just confident about it. I mean, I can't prove it. I just think we will. Let's see. Who have I not heard from? Okay, yes.
I just wanted to follow on from what you were saying. Do you think it's even possible at that level of sophistication to fake it then? Are we getting to a point where it's effectively, you'll have to have a proper working AI that is as good as artificial intelligence as we want it to be? If you follow what I'm saying. Can we actually make one that is, because it's fine in dramas when you've got script writers who give, doesn't matter how crappy the line is, that's the only thing they're ever going to say, because it's a fixed thing that happens in linear time. But when you've got to have some kind of, especially as we're getting more and more interactive, we're not going to find, we effectively have to make actual intelligence for it to work.
Right. Well,
big philosophical question, perfect for a couple of minutes before the end.
The trade-off will come first. There's a couple of things we can do that help that. One of them is that by having a relatively narrow domain, right? You, like I said, you don't expect to be able to discuss Wittgenstein with the bartender, right? You know, or if you take a novel by Jane Austen, you know, you don't expect to discuss John Stuart Mill with Elizabeth Bennet either.
Or even just John Stewart.
Yeah, right. So, you know, provided that you restrict the domain to the sort of set of topics that are appropriate for the story you're trying to tell, I think that's okay. The other thing, and this is sort of the key point in my PhD thesis, is that when a player goes into an interactive story, they agree to play a role, right? And their job is to enact that role within that story. And if they choose to go off the rails and do something completely bizarre and outrageous, you know, like if you're playing a 19th century Jane Austen game, and you ask Elizabeth Bennet, you know, hey baby, you want to hook up tonight? You know, I mean, if the game goes bluey, well, that's not really the designer's fault, right? That's the player's fault, because they have abandoned the role that they agreed to play. So, you know, there is a degree to which the player has to cooperate in the construction of their own experience, and that is their personal, what they choose to put into the game world. So there's a very funny online thing, I'll try to keep this short, but in Facade, Facade keeps a script of everything that's happened, and somebody went in to play Facade, and the very first thing they said when they opened the door is, "I've been shot!" And the guy says, "Well, hi, come on in, I haven't seen you in a while." "I'm bleeding, call the police!" "Well, I'll go get Grace, let her say hi to you too." And it's just totally failing to deal with this, and it's pretty funny. But, there's no games in the Facade world. No guns, I'm sorry. No guns in that world. It's not realistic to expect those people because you're role-playing outside the boundaries of the domain. You had a question. And then you need to tell me when it's time to shut up. Yes?
Yeah, let's make this the last question.
Okay.
All right. So, right now, the way that most games are made is that we have game objects, we have something representing a tree, for example, and if we want the behavior of the tree to change, we can put modules on it, components. So we have a very game object and component-based model of doing games right now. But it's still very much we have to manually set all this up. do you think that AI or like other procedural techniques are going to affect how we do stuff, like actual developing?
Yeah, you're getting into an area that is really outside my expertise. I haven't written a line of code since 1992. So, you know, I think what you're probably talking about is automated programming, or some kind of AI support for programming that enables greater sophistication for creating these kinds of things. I mean, we went from coding on the bare metal to coding in high-level languages with strong typing to object-oriented coding, and what's next? You know, I don't know. It's, you know, there are people who are looking at creating coding, artificially intelligent coding assistants that you can actually call in and say, I need a thing to do something like this, and it will generate code for you that will do the kind of thing that you want. But it's not an area I've given that much effort to exploring. By 2050, that's really hard. By 2050, we will be partway down that road. You will be able to instantiate a bartender. Give me a bartender, and it will be able to look like and say and do all the kind of standard things that a bartender will do. And it may be a bit more sophisticated in terms of its responses. So, for example, right now, in a role-playing game, if you go tell the blacksmith, hey, buddy, your forge is on fire, he's going to say, can I sell you some weapons? Because that's all the blacksmiths do in role-playing games, right? They're just an exchange mechanism that turns gold into weapons. And they don't respond properly to their forge being on fire. So I think in the future, we will be able to instantiate people whose behavior is a little bit more realistic than that, and we'll be able to sort of drag and drop them. Give me a bartender, and I want him to wear a fedora, those kinds of things, and it'll be pretty easy. And they will react more appropriately to unusual events. But you still won't be able to discuss Wittgenstein. So, okay, thank you all very much for your time and your passion.